just like that, we're live around the world. Welcome to the .NET Doc Show. I'm one of your hosts, David Pine, and with us today, we've got obviously co-host Cam and Scott, and a good friend of ours. In fact, we just met, so I can't say great friend, but we want to become your friends, Jeremy. You're doing some amazing things. This is Jeremy Sinclair.
Hello, everybody.
So how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, especially after dealing with some unexpected technical difficulties, but we made it work.
What would a day be like as a developer without technical difficulties every once in a while, right?
Not a very developer-focused day.
So tell us a bit about yourself, Jeremy. What are you working on lately? What do you got going on? Who are you? Where are you from?
So I'm Jeremy Sinclair, as everyone knows. I live in Wheeling, West Virginia. I work as an enterprise .NET developer at a law firm, and I do a lot of ASP.NET Core, SharePoint, PowerShell, you name it.
All the fun stuff. That sounds awesome.
Oh, yeah.
So what's it like being an enterprise developer in .NET these days? Is it fun? Is it more fun? And I'm trying to bait you a little bit with like saying, hey, .NET Core is more fun than Framework, but what's it like?
So in the enterprise realm, there's always the possibility that you're going to be dealing with some very old code bases because it's kind of a set it and forget it for the most part, and you're dealing with maintaining that particular code base. But I think at the place I'm at, kind of lucky that we're able to move things forward and innovate. So I've been able to kind of introduce ASP.NET Core to my team and get everyone on board with it.
Has it been pretty well adopted? Has there been resistance? And I know I've got a bunch of experience with working with enterprises. Before joining Microsoft, I was a consultant working in enterprise. And there was certainly a level of resistance, right? Like it's kind of like, don't move our cheese, and there's slight variances and people kind of get stuck in their ways. So how have you been combating that?
Well, the first thing that I did to bring ASP.NET Core to my team is we had a project where this time we were able to basically build an internal website and do client-side API calls. So the first thing I did, and this was back, I think, ASP.NET Core 1.0, so I was an early adopter. I decided that maybe we just build something in ASP.NET Core then. So I built an API project that we use for this internal portal we have. And as soon as I got everyone on board with how easy it is to set it up, you don't have to deal with all these 900 configs and binding redirects. That kind of made everyone easy.
Yeah, an easy sell. That's awesome. Cool. Do you guys have any questions, Cam and Scott?
No, I'm just stoked to meet Jeremy. I followed him on Twitter for a while.
Yeah, me too.
Seems like a cool guy. So.
Yeah, I was going to say it's great to hear someone else had used ASP.NET Core in the 1.0 days. I feel like that was a very different time we were living in. The tooling wasn't yet mature. I think we still had the Project JSON system at that time instead of the CS Proj. Very, very different.
Oh, and there was DNX and all that stuff too. That was like .NET. Yeah. Can
I just point out, so what I miss most about saying DNX is people would often confuse that with DMX. You would shout out DMX on stage, and it just felt good.
That's funny.
And I can say, honestly, from all of my experience with what it was called MVC6 initially, from the beginnings of it, all the way up to where we are now, I've had pretty pleasant experience. And it's really awesome that if I want to target a specific runtime, I can do that. If I can throw it on my Mac or run in Linux, I can do that. So I think that's the big thing for me.
That is awesome. That's awesome. All right, so we're going to jump into the doc checkup. So we're going to switch up a little bit here. We got a new segment. So
All right, everyone. So something new we're trying this week is this new segment called the Checkup. And what we want to do with this segment is focus on a piece of content that has been produced recently that folks might not have seen, something that may be of interest. Typically, we'll try to align this content with the topic for the show. What do we have today, Dave and Cam, for the doc?
Yeah, today we're actually going to be sharing SignalR hub filters. It's a new doc that was written over in ASP.NET land, and it's pretty interesting in terms of concept. I know that we've done some casual conversations before in the past about SignalR. I know personally, David Fowler and Brady Gasser both really appreciate when we talk about SignalR, and it's something that's an amazing technology. So SignalR at its core is basically, it enables duplex real-time web communication. And one of the things that they've added recently is this concept of hub filters. So hub filters serve as, it's very similar in terms of the way it was architected, and certainly the way I perceive it is to ASP.NET Core middleware, if you liken it to that. In middleware, you could kind of determine where to ingest bits of code in a request response pipeline. So now this is with hub filters and SignalR. In those communications, you can actually add code that will execute before or after or both when hub endpoints are kind of executed. So it's a really neat concept. So this doc, we have an akka link that we had shared there in the bottom.
I would add to what David said there. This truly does remind me of middleware. If you've used that in ASP.NET Core, in particular, you'll notice there's a next method that you invoke to call the next filter in the chain. You might also think of this concept as something like action filters, if you've used that in MVC or Web API in the past. The other thing to note here, there's, it's very, very simple to create your own hub filter, much like it's pretty straightforward to create your own middleware. It's nothing more than a C# class that implements an interface named iHubFilter, and there's 3 different ways you can register that hub filter. All of that is outlined in this doc that we're showing here, and you will notice the akka link scrolling on the bottom of the screen here.
So,
Awesome.
so the idea here is, and this is the first time I've looked at this doc myself. So I'm guessing that the idea is to get into the request and response pipeline in SignalR and be able to tweak responses and be able to treat requests before they get to the hub and responses after they leave the hub, kind of like HTTP filters. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Any kind of logic that you want to run either before or after your hub methods are invoked, this is what you would use.
Gotcha.
Same thing you would have done with what I mentioned earlier, action filters and, say, Web API.
So Jeremy, have you used SignalR out of curiosity?
I haven't used it in its standalone instance. I have used Blazor.
Okay.
So from that standpoint, I've used it, but I've always kind of wanted to dive into it, though.
That brings up an interesting point. Yeah, a lot of folks don't even know they're using SignalR, right? They're like, I'm going to crack open Blazor, and they follow whatever tutorial, and may not realize how much it's all driven by SignalR on the back end.
Yeah, Blazor's pretty neat in that way. It's Blazor's what's using for like the server side rendering. So basically, it opens up a Blazor communication, and your SPA application will update segments of the DOM based on those communications. It's pretty neat. Cool. Well, yeah, let's dive right into the hallway track. So the hallway track is something we're doing special. This is one of our new segments, probably one of my favorite parts of what's going to be our future shows. So if you're a developer, I'm assuming you are if you're watching this, you've more than likely attended a developer conference, and nowadays those aren't really a thing that's common, right, with the way of the world. So this is a virtual hallway track. So one of the things I valued most at developer conferences was actually the hallway track, the conversations in the hallway outside of the context of sitting in there and being lectured or talked to or learning something. Just those casual conversations, picking the brains of someone who gave a talk perhaps. And while this isn't going to fulfill those exact needs, we're very hopeful that this will kind of serve as a backup to that. So this is the virtual hallway track brought to you by the .NET Doc Show. And today we've got Jeremy Sinclair, and we're going to talk about ARM and .NET Core and some awesome stuff. So yeah, hopefully if you got questions, make sure you ask him. Jeremy said he's excited. He wants to answer some questions.
So first question for Jeremy. I know we probably have folks who will tune in, or maybe they're already tuned in, and they hear the term ARM, and they think, okay, this is an acronym I've not heard before. What really are we talking about when we say ARM?
So what we're talking about when we bring up ARM is think of it as the processor in your phones. So it's a kind of a mobile processor and instruction set. So you have your x86 and your x64, and you have your ARM and your ARM64. So with that, ARM is probably one of my biggest obsessions. You'll see me tweeting about it a lot. And it's mostly because of the Windows on ARM. Mostly because of the...
That's awesome. Yeah, I heard an echo too. That's all right. I think we got to figure it out.
No, that was me. Sorry.
So go ahead.
Well, so I just have a question. So when we start talking about developing on like the ARM CPU architecture, what do you is there a whole lot that we need to do differently there in .NET Core, or do we just pick up and target that environment? What's the different kinds of things that you have to know if you're targeting that architecture?
Well, one thing to know is if you're targeting the architecture, you can target it from an x64 or x86. It will do a cross compilation, but you won't be able to run it on those machines. So you'll need an ARM machine. Like say for Linux, you can use a Raspberry Pi. So Raspberry Pi is ARM and ARM64 based, which is something really amazing that .NET Core enables, is that ability to run everywhere. And the reason why anyone should target ARM is you see how well your phones run, you see how well your iPad, and you see that the Windows on ARM, the Surface Pro X. I use this thing for everything, and I'm actually on it right now.
No kidding.
Yeah, the efficiency is phenomenal.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah,
That's incredible.
This is all running on. I think I'm running Edge Canary.
Wow, that's
So-
incredible.
So
No skips or anything. It's flawless.
so the number one thing when I look at Windows on ARM, the number one thing that pops out to me about what is attractive about Windows on ARM is battery life. So tell me about what you're getting in terms of battery life.
So in terms of battery life on here, I get a good maybe 10 to 12 hours of usage. So I can have a good 10, 12 browser tabs up, playing around in VS Code and listening to music. And it doesn't skip a beat.
That's impressive. I get like 5 hours out of my Surface.
Awesome. We've got a question actually from LQ Dev 1. He says, how do you see Apple's new chips, how they might affect the current ARM workloads for .NET?
So the Apple Silicon, that was the thing that really made me happy. Because I think now that you see Apple actually embracing the ARM architecture, and they're saying that it is well enough that they're going to put it in MacBooks and Macs, I see a wonderful opportunity for the .NET team to add further, further improvements to target the Apple Silicon, because they've already done a lot of work with targeting ARM on Linux, and with .NET 5, we're going to see full-on supported Windows on ARM.
That's amazing. I always I feel as though in my career I've steered myself more towards being like a web developer. So I kind of missed the boat when it came to some of the things that happened in the realm with Mono at the runtime, and like, Xamarin, and being like a cross-platform developer for mobile. So what is this all? How does this all relate to ARM? And can you talk about that some?
So I see a lot of that work that's been done on Xamarin with Mono. I see that as kind of like the precursor that opened the floodgates. Because, with Microsoft, you've had the Surface RT, and you had the Windows Phone, which...
The Windows Phone. Oof.
Yeah,
Oof.
That was actually my entry. That was my entry
okay.
into C#, surprisingly.
Oh, that's awesome, though. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just got to hop in there. Let's all pour one out for poor old Windows Phone, because I miss that guy.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah,
Beautiful.
lots of people are saying they love their Windows Phone.
Beautiful piece of hardware. I think I had one of the Lumias. Was it the 720? Love the phone. It's just the fact I could not find apps for it, and that's ultimately why I ditched it.
Was that the Metro UI, like the Windows 8 Metro UI? That's like where that all came from.
Live tiles, yeah.
Yeah, it started in Windows Phone 7, and then they updated a little bit for 8, and then they came out with Windows Phone 10 and ruined most of it.
I love that, because I was shocked when I first saw like the new Windows look when it came out for Windows 8, and like,
oh yeah, that's where I was, and I think just with the way Windows Phone 8 and Windows 8 came about, that really led me down the path of, okay, I want to start building things that can target multiple systems. And once Windows 10 and Windows 10 Mobile came out with UWP, I felt that was getting closer to a unified platform.
that's cool.
So I didn't mean to derail the conversation, Jeremy. I'm so sorry. I just miss my Windows Phone so much. I had to call it out.
Too.
I don't think that's the first time Cam's stopped the show to talk about Windows Phone. I think that happened in one of our earlier episodes at one point in time too. It's funny.
It probably will happen again.
Right, and I think that all still that's still applicable to this conversation, because you see all that work that's been done to support ARM from the .NET standpoint. So many things exist that were, I guess, kind of experimental from the Windows Phone. So if you think about the ability we have now to run Windows subsystem for Linux, that came from Project Astoria from the Windows Phone. And just like the amount of that performance, because I had a Xamarin app that we developed at work, and I wanted to test to see if it worked on the Windows Phone. It worked flawlessly through that little container. And so it's just really cool to see how we have multiple ways to bring .NET everywhere.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
All that work is continuing on.
I remember for me, there was it was 2016. I built a magic mirror on a Raspberry Pi 3 Model B. And that was my introduction to working on a Raspberry Pi. And I only did it because I could use C#. And that's when like the .NET Core, there was like Windows, I'm trying to remember what it was. But basically there was some sort of build that would let me do Windows 10-ish. Maybe it was IoT Core. Windows 10 IoT Core. Okay, that's what it was. But yeah, it was C#, and I could make API calls. It had a Wi-Fi chip. I could do all this cool stuff with it. And it was just like, that's what I want. As a C# developer, I want to be able to develop anywhere.
Now, when you're developing something like that, I guess this is a question for the three of you. How do you test something like that? Do you just test in production, or do you have test devices or containers that you're using? How does that work?
Well, I know for me, I usually first try to use the emulators or simulators if they exist. So for the Windows Phone, they had the Windows Phone emulators. They had the iOS simulator and Android emulator. Those all work well to a point, but you need a test device if you want to get the full performance and the full features.
Yeah, and so that's kind of what I feared. I wonder if that's a barrier to entry for some developers. Just there's that upfront expense that you incur. You need, a small set of test devices, or maybe just one, to truly test the functionality you're developing. Thoughts on that? Because I have to believe that emulators don't give you 100% of what you need to test.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think I used an emulator for my Windows 10 IoT Core development. Since it was a UWP app, I could actually develop it on my Windows machine and run it as a regular Windows app. So some of the testing was absolutely done in production, right? I'd have to deploy it to the Magic Mirror and then fire it up and just run it and see what happened. There was some huge discrepancies though, where I think an emulator might have been impactful to kind of simulate like how much slower the Raspberry Pi's CPU was and stuff like that, and like the number of threads and whatever you had available, like just the resource constraints you had on that type of device. Using my beastly dev machine, it was a lot different kind of debugging from my machine than actually running it over, doing API calls and async await stuff and trying to do cognitive services stuff. It was a lot different of an experience.
Oh yeah, I bet. Well, and I think if there were, I guess, more device availability at, I guess, reasonable prices, that's one of the things that I want to see change. For instance, I want a lot of people to get into building for ARM so I can run it on my Surface Pro X, but there's only you have a few devices out there that have that power to be able to run these programs, and I don't know how many people really want to spend the money for that, and that's kind of my dilemma, because when I first saw that the Surface Pro X was coming out, I immediately hopped on it because I wanted to develop for it.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a really good point. I can totally relate to that. I think that made me just think about like the HoloLens. And I know that when that first came out like years ago, I remember, I don't know if it was 2016 or 2015, but I was at Build and I remember seeing it and I was like, wow, this is amazing. I want to develop for this. And they're like, yeah, it's like $3,500. I'm like, nope, I don't want to develop for it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's the point I'm trying to make here is you guys have nailed it on the head. I think back to when I was working in the financial services industry, and we wanted to start developing mobile applications. iOS is a platform we needed to support because a large portion of our customer base was on iPhones. There was this need to have a Mac so we could compile the code. And just that requirement alone all of a sudden made a technology like Xamarin less appealing. And I don't mean to pick on Xamarin, but I guess that made mobile development less appealing just in general because there was that expense required. And for that reason alone, the company had decided, well, we're not going to bother building mobile apps at all. Instead, what we're going to do is build responsive web apps using Bootstrap that will just scale down to the viewport size they need to support.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of that happen because before Xamarin came about, you either had that direct native development on a Mac if you Mac specific, or you just built a responsive web page, and you only get as a decent amount of performance, in my personal opinion, because you have companies that want to build to support mobile without realizing that the browsers don't have these infinite amount of threads that you're going to see on these desktop machines. So you run into so many slowness issues. And
Absolutely.
I think another barrier, in addition to what I just described, could be this perception that it requires a very specialized skill set to do this type of development. If you want to start developing on ARM, I guess this is a question for you, Jeremy. Have you found that to be a challenge in just finding developers who are interested in developing that skill set?
From what I've seen is there's the default opinion is I'm going to develop for the masses. So the bulk of the machines that everyone has, it's going to be an x64 related machine. And when it comes to like Linux and Mac, primarily that's it. But there's still some issues when it comes to developing for ARM in regards to Windows, because there's still a lot of development going on. Because it's easier to like Clang and LLVM, they have that support to cross compile into ARM native code, which is fantastic. Because all the developer has to do is add a flag to the project for the most part, and you have an ARM native binary that'll run if you target Linux or Windows. But I think there needs to be a smooth consistency for that true cross-platform and cross-compilation experience to be top-notch. And I know, I think yesterday there was a WinUI, what's called a WinUI community call, and they are adding WPF support into .NET 5 for Windows and ARM. And I think a lot of people are waiting for that, because right now you can do with I think as of Preview 6, you do have WinForm support for .NET 5 to target ARM, and it's fantastic actually.
So targeting ARM, you could do WinForms, you're saying,
and UWP right now.
And UWP. So out of curiosity, why would you want to do WPF if you had UWP? Like, aren't they kind of like, isn't UWP like the evolution of WPF?
It's the next step up. So
okay.
You have a lot of people who have, I guess, the legacy .NET apps, and just, hey, right click, new project, WPF app, here you go. Those projects, there's still people who maintain them and move forward. And the reason why that has to exist is when you first came out with the UWP on Windows 10, a lot of the new features that were built into the OS, those WPF apps and WinForms apps, you couldn't get them. They were just left in the cold. And I believe that Microsoft's seen like, okay, we're shutting out a significant part of our developers, so we need to find a way to be able to provide these cool new controls and features from the OS, so that WinForms, all of Win32 and UWP, all of that can be used across the board.
You bring up a really interesting point, like just this idea of Microsoft evolving and introducing new technologies, and support kind of dying off for certain things that have been so well adopted. So I know that like Apple, for example, they'll just completely drop things, and Google's really good at that too. And to hear that Microsoft is doing something similar, like, what do you think could be done to kind of help address that? Do you think like with .NET 5 and them saying that they're going to bring on WPF, is that something that's going to help out a bunch of people in the community?
Well, I'd have to make a little correction. So WPF and WinForm support for everything that isn't ARM already exists in .NET Core 3.
Right.
So I think that, well, this is my hope, really. Once WPF is there, you can see like a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have we'll be able to see more of these apps that can't be targeted right now to ARM, just suddenly be able to be used. So, for instance, I think, was it MMC? The MMC console, it's still running x86. Like, there's a lot of stuff like on the Windows on ARM that is x86 compiled because there's no WPF support.
So let me ask a question there. Just because I've never touched Windows on ARM and I'm fascinated by it. So like in like Task Manager, is there some kind of an indication that you can look at a process and go, oh, this process is running in an x86 mode with like an ARM shim or something? Does it work like that?
There is a column that you can add in that has the actual processor architecture, so you can see which architecture that binary is running under. And so that's really the indicator to know whether it's ARM 32, ARM 64, x86.
That's fascinating. Today I learned. I had no
Today I learned.
I wanted to point out, so we've got the UWP versus WPF boxing gloves on. We have a chat comment in the chat saying, the fact that UWP required a Windows Store app was a hassle, and that there was a lack of some really useful abstractions in WPF. Also pointing out the debugging experience wasn't great. Have you found any of those observations to be true, Jeremy?
Yes. So here's one thing that is a pain if you're trying to do what anyone does as soon as they get a Windows on ARM machine. Try to use Visual Studio on it. So Visual Studio itself, it runs fairly nice.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one, I guess, bottleneck with UWP development when targeting ARM64. It's running .NET native every time. And so it's doing that a full-on kind of native compilation of the .NET code into just like that native ARM code, basically release mode for UWP apps. You're doing that every single time you debug, and it's really painful because there's a big wait. You can't just like click debug and the app opens. There's a lot of processes that run in order to make that app container.
Interesting. So, because right away when you first started saying that, I was immediately thinking to myself, would a way to solve that be to use Visual Studio Code? But it doesn't sound like it, right? If it's doing all of these compilations and there's multiple processes that are involved, it doesn't matter what tool set you're using necessarily. It's just part of the experience, right?
Right. And obviously, and I think this is one of the reasons why the debugging support for ARM is pretty much set up that you have to use an x64 machine if you want to add in that target and have it compile properly. But you have to use remote debugging for the ARM machines. And I think that's probably why, because there's just too much pain with it. If you're trying to build the UWP apps and do the .NET native from the Windows 10 on ARM to itself, The big pain is that the actual .NET native compiler is running as an x86 binary. So it's doing x86 to ARM64 translation.
It's just hard for me to wrap my head around that. That's a lot. That's very well said.
Yeah, it is.
It sounds like a pain.
It is, but I think there's a lot of possibility for things to get better. And back on the .NET front, ever since .NET became open source, there's so much community involvement, and it's so inspirational to just look through the issues, look through the pull requests, and even jump into the code and see what's really going on in the background. And with the call for developers to pop in their issues and contribute, I have a feeling that we'll see things run a lot smoother.
I agree 100%. I think back to the olden days of Visual Studio where you had to wait 2 to 3 years for a new release, let's say. And if by the way you uncovered a defect in the .NET framework, you had to wait for a new version of that to come out, and who knows, that could be a year before you saw a new version. We truly are living in this new kind of world where now if I encounter some kind of defect in .NET Core, or if we're talking about .NET 5, just .NET, as a developer, if I know where that code lives on GitHub, I can go out there and like Jeremy says, file an issue, or I can even dive into the code and see, well, what is the code doing and why is it not working the way that I would expect?
Correct. And honestly, that's doing just that was enough for me to start diving into the .NET runtime code. Probably one of the first things I did when I got my Pro X is try to build the .NET Core 3.1 for it. And I didn't know what I was doing whatsoever. I just went down a rabbit hole of searching for anything that had x86 and x64, any sort of like flags and conditionals. And it led me down the rabbit hole to, if it weren't for the previous work to get to that point, I was able to compile .NET Core, the .NET Core SDK to run directly from my Pro X.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that was like one of my favorite achievements, because then I could, first thing I did was I loaded up a Blazor app.
That's so cool.
It works. That's what blew my mind. Like this foundation, the foundation of the code that was needed to support ARM64, it was already there, and it's not even fully supported right now on .NET Core 3.1. Even though you can build binaries for it, you can't. It's not, the SDK itself isn't supported for running from ARM64 on Windows. So that was just something that really inspired me to start digging through the source code and just seeing what I could understand more. I think with VS Code being natively supported for ARM64 on Windows now, that opens the floodgates.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, I love that. We always talk about like it's a new Microsoft, and it's awesome that we're open source. And I just want to take a step back and say that open source has existed for a long time. Microsoft didn't invent it, and it's just new to .NET developers. It's a new experience because before Microsoft, took this initiative to become more open source, open source had already existed. I just want to make sure we're really clear on that.
Right. Yeah, it really makes me happy that they've embraced it, because I've seen so much stuff, enough that I felt that I needed to become a .NET Foundation member. That's
awesome. Congrats on that, by the way. That's great.
Well, I've been one for, it's my second year.
Okay. Have you considered running for the board of directors at all?
Not yet. I'm still just pure I like to code,
Sure.
code and code. But I think eventually I may.
I would
So
vote for you.
thanks.
On that note, when the board of directors is when it's election season and everybody's running for the board, it makes it so hard to pick because we know so many great people that would serve on that board. Yeah, I would vote for Jeremy, but I would pretty much vote for anybody that I've seen run.
Yeah, there's some amazing candidates, and I like that there is a push for it because I love .NET. It's one of the things that really makes me happy. Even though my first experience was me being kind of pushed into it from the SharePoint standpoint, because I am also a SharePoint developer. I just see that there's so much code I can reuse across the board, and I can bring all of that functionality, that mindset, and I can build a .NET Core / .NET 5 app and run it on my Mac. That's the thing I like.
I was just going to say I feel that 100%. Like that's my favorite thing about .NET now is like this whole discussion we've been having. You can pick it up and run it on an ARM processor. You can run it in Linux. You can run it in Mac OS. Anybody who has seen like my smoker, knows that I'm big on running on Raspberry Pi, and there is just an unbridled joy for me in typing .NET publish -R. I forget the CPU identifier, but Linux /ARM, whatever, and getting this little package that I could pick up and run on this little device here that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. It's just so cool.
And it's C#. I just want to put that in there.
Right, well, that's my point. The fact that it's in C#. Yeah.
Well, and even going back to .NET and its core. So my introduction to the .NET framework was through PowerShell. Funny enough.
Okay.
So I knew PowerShell before I knew C#. So when PowerShell Core came out, the first thing I did was use one of the PowerShell scripts I had for downloading lots of files in parallel. I copied and pasted, threw it on my Mac, and saw that it ran. I'm like, are you serious?
That's so cool.
And I just find that so amazing now, because it's really, I think it's at a point where anyone who used to be in the .NET game left out of frustration from the many breaking changes back in the day. I think we're at a point now where I tell everyone, come on back.
Come on back.
Look, it's time to reevaluate it from a serious standpoint without any preconceptions. And if there's any issues, anything you don't like, file them. The repos are out there.
That's such a fantastic point you made. Come on back to .NET. We will embrace you with open and loving arms. I look at this a lot like if you've ever done any SPA development with Angular, there was this big shift from AngularJS to Angular, significant breaking changes. David's shaking his head, so I know he felt that pain.
Oh, but yes, very much so.
I relate that transition from AngularJS to Angular and the significant breaking changes to what happened with .NET. I almost wonder if the framework should have been called something else that excluded the name .NET. Just because there is this perception, people used it 7-8 years ago, and they still think, okay, I'm shackled to Windows. It's this crusty old framework that's only used in the enterprise.
Right, and I like that those barriers have been broken down, because there's so much that can be learned by from running on those different platforms. There's so much knowledge where you go back and say, this runs really perfect over here. We could be doing this better. How about we just further optimize across the board?
Yep.
That's a really interesting point. I know, like a lot of enterprise development too. it was probably 5 years ago where it was shifting towards people were adopting Node.js like crazy. And I don't know if that was just the Midwest where I'm from, or not, or if it was more, global, but Node.js was where it was at. And then ASP.NET Core came out and .NET Core came out, and they started doing like the Tech Empower benchmarks and started really having this compelling story with, requests processed per second. And it's like, now it's like a game changer, like all the things that they're doing to help developers be productive and open source and transparent about it. And just, it's really awesome. For me, the less JavaScript we have in the world, the better place it's going to be.
And that's why I love Blazor. Because honestly, the first thing I did with Blazor is I built like a simple kind of step wizard, because I was making like an admin screen that I had with .NET Core MVC, and I had some JavaScript that I needed, and I'm like, I'm copy and pasting everywhere. There's no way I can do this without it being hacky. And then I thought, you know what, we're gonna try Blazor out, and the fact that I have I think I only have one line of actual JavaScript via the JS interrupt that has to run. Everything else is through C# and just the Razor syntax. And the fact that I can see that run and you get that client-side interaction immediately that was a game changer for me. I loved it. I'm like, this is the new thing. This is what I've been waiting for.
That's so awesome.
Honestly, for me, I'm more of a back-end developer, and I know that there's many times there's possibly a lot of teams that get pushed into doing front-end development and get real comfortable because of the ASP.NET Core framework. Just it got real comfortable with all those controls built in that did everything for you. That all you had to do is plug something in and be done with it. But just not having to primarily rely on JavaScript if I don't need to, and see, okay, I could either have this server-side interaction or use WebAssembly with Blazor. I'm just like, this is where it needs to be. I love it.
Yeah, the beauty of that is, Blazor doesn't necessarily set out to make JavaScript extinct, so to speak. You can still write as much JavaScript as you please. In fact, if you decided to take an existing single-page app and start doing your new development on that app with Blazor, those two tech stacks can happily coexist. That's been one thing that I've really enjoyed about it. I've talked to customers who have existing React applications, or maybe they have a small investment in Vue, and they want to start slowly walking towards this Blazor offering that we have. They're able to do that thanks to this JavaScript interop that Jeremy has been talking about.
Yeah, it's awesome. And to even dive further on that, the fact that the possibilities that .NET brings across the board, I want to give a shout out to Uno platform, because what they've done with doing like a true cross-platform with a UWP style of XAML to be able to run on their WebAssembly offering and do iOS and Android and target Windows and I think a few other platforms, including Mac, actually. All of that is just phenomenal. And the fact that you're having some of those improvements being brought into the .NET runtime. So like, it's just that collaboration across the board. It's like, okay, if Microsoft is like, we don't want to go down this path, you have someone who wants to do something, wants to achieve that vision. There's collaboration there, and that's what I like.
I agree. It's all about collaboration. That's perfectly said.
And I think it's important to recognize it's not just collaboration from Microsoft partners. It's also collaboration from the open source community. So folks who just want to dig in and learn more about the tech, they might have a few extra hours each week or each night, and they might choose to use that time to just better the community as a whole.
Right, and that's the most important part, because I think .NET is only going to get better with more community collaboration.
Absolutely. I think that's what the show is trying to do, is really embrace and celebrate the community that's out there, and celebrate the external contributions that we get. And, we're really humbled by them and we're grateful for them. So I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, out of curiosity, is there any documentation that you've relied on that's been helpful? I know that you mentioned GitHub as being a source where there's issues and obviously the source code so you can actually look at it, but has the documentation for the ARM story for .NET been helpful to you at all? If not, what gaps could we fill?
Well, I know that in terms of Visual Studio, the documentation for targeting ARM, I know it's gotten better. Because at first there was still a lot of kind of randomness, stuff that was targeting Visual Studio 2015. There was like one blog post that spoke about, here's all you have to do in order to target ARM. But I know a lot of developers got confused because it's like, okay, well, we're using Visual Studio 2019 now. What do we do with that? And I've been really appreciating the .NET 5 blogs that have been coming out, adding in that information about, here's the status of where we're at with ARM and what we plan on doing. Here's what's available now. The more that we see that out in those blogs and out in the wild, it makes people like me feel amazing. Makes me feel like, okay, they care. They're going to continue supporting this, and it's not going to, possibly just fall off and be deprecated.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I could say the .NET docs. That was actually one of the comments I made at Build a few years ago. Once the docs.microsoft.com, once I started seeing all the information load into there, like, it's finally in one spot. That was my biggest thing. The documentation's it's very detailed, and it's enough to get me to where I need. I know sometimes I know my teammates might not appreciate the fact that they ask me a question and I immediately hit them with a docs link. But the rest of the time, that's how I learn. If it's not from debugging or searching through the source code, there's some link. There's something in the docs that gives you what you need. I think the only thing is you have to fully read it, not skim down. Because I've made the mistake of skimming through, and there was a link for further information. Yeah, I didn't click that link at first, and then after I went through hours of suffering, realized that the answer was right there in my face.
Right.
Yeah, there's been so it sounds like Jeremy has observed this, and I'm happy to hear that. There's been a significant investment from Microsoft in documentation. If you look at MSDN, which I think is what Jeremy was talking about, how he's seen such an improvement from those days, we've come a very long ways. One other thing I wanted to talk about is you mentioned blog posts for .NET 5. We do try to incorporate as much of that as we can into the docs platform. One of the big reasons for that is localization. So we recognize that not all of the audiences we want to reach speak U.S. English. In fact, U.S. English, I think, is the third most popular language in the world today. Spanish, Chinese. Those are super popular. We want to make sure we're also catering to those audiences. So again, whenever you see some content in a blog post, if you don't eventually see that make its way into docs, give us a heads up. Create an issue in one of the docs repos, because ultimately we would like to see all of that information find its way into a localized form.
Absolutely. I was going to say we've got about roughly 5 minutes left, so let's ask Jeremy what some of your closing thoughts are.
My closing thoughts are, if you're a .NET developer, or if you used to be a .NET developer and you're just wondering how to do anything with it, read the documentation. Docs on Microsoft.com. There's .NET. There's try.net. There's a lot of resources out there. I want to see more people embrace .NET because I like it personally, and I think there's a lot of things that can be great with it. So there's a lot of promise.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's like the capabilities are, .NET's finally becoming kind of what JavaScript had morphed into, where JavaScript is everywhere. Now I feel like .NET can be everywhere, right? Like you can just do .NET and it can be anywhere.
Right. And I just actually want to thank all the companies, all the teams, and all the open source developers contributing wonderful things built off of .NET and for .NET for doing what they did, because it's keeping me in the game. It's keeping me occupied. It's making me want to do more. So I urge all of that collaboration to continue.
I think that's a good message to send. One closing thought I would have is there actually was a time, and David mentioned Node.js. There was a time before .NET Core where I already had one foot out the door, and I thought, there's not really anything innovative happening in .NET. It's been the same old framework for years. Maybe I should go check out Node.js. The grass, I guess I'd say the grass seemed greener on that side of the fence. Now that we have what we have in this day and age, I'm certainly glad I, stuck around in the .NET community.
Yeah, I was kind of right there with you. It was a lot of just minor things that became annoyances in the beginning, but I have seen from a lot of the GitHub issues, just that back and forth, just the discussion, the deep discussions, and just what those were able to spawn. That is what I like to see more of, because everyone can shape the future of .NET.
That's super impactful. That's a
think
great message.
Right. There's like a kind of a misconception that it's only Microsoft is shaping .NET. Yes, I see there's a lot of internal stuff still, but the bulk of it is all open source, and then that collaboration. Tell us what you want. And the more people that get in there and try to drive that conversation, we can get .NET to the point where it needs to sustain itself for the future.
That's so well said. That's perfect. You started this closing thoughts with, thanking the community, and I just want to take a moment to thank you for being our guest. You've been amazing. I've learned a ton just from talking to you. I followed you on Twitter for a long time. Going to continue to do so. I hope others do. Check out Jeremy Sinclair here. Any other closing thoughts, you guys? Scott, Cam, anything?
I would echo your thoughts, David. I feel extremely fortunate to be able to host wonderful people from the community like Jeremy. It's also nice to just have this virtual hallway track. Not everyone in our audience was fortunate enough to attend in-person events and talk to people like Jeremy. By bringing this to a venue like Twitch, I feel like we're filling a need that was there. At least I hope.
Yeah, and I would just I like this. I want to see more of these conversations happen. This is cool. I really like it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Until next time, folks, take care.